Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Mozart Data Symphony #1. It's our first user conference, and I'm excited to be here and to have you all here. My name is Pete Fishman. I go by Fish. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mozart Data. I'll be joined today by some incredible speakers, and I'm really looking forward to the event. Hope you are as well. So probably you're guessing by the name, Mozart Data Symphony #1. We'll be talking a little bit about Mozart Data. But this is not just a conference for customers and prospects. This is trying to be a conference really for everyone. Everyone interested in the evolution of data analysis and modern data stacks. And you'll hear a lot from a lot of different perspectives on both topics. But first, let me start by taking you on a bit of a personal journey, my own journey into the world of analytics and data analysis. So in 2003, I read Michael Lewis's book, Moneyball. And ostensibly, what Moneyball is about the following graphs. The Oakland A's were trying to get great players, specifically great hitters. And traditionally, when you wanted to understand great hitting, you would look at batting average, which was basically how often you got a hit per at bat. What the A's discovered was that there is a tighter relationship between on-base percentage, which is another stat that also incorporates walks with runs, than there is with batting average and runs. So average seems like the right way to measure sort of offensive goodness, but on-base percentage is. And the A's were able to take advantage of that. Now we'll come back to this in just a moment. In 2008, I started my career in the NFL, not as a linebacker, but as a statistician. And if you join the NFL as a player, first you go through a public workout called the Combine. And at the Combine, they measure a number of things. And one really important skill in the NFL is speed, just being really, really fast. And they have a bunch of different speed drills. Two of them are the 40-yard dash, where you run straight for 40 yards, and the 3-cone drill, where you run around 3 cones. Now, the 40-yard dash seems like it's a great way to understand speed, but the 3-cone drill is a great way to understand speed, because for the most part, people are, in an NFL game, moving side to side as well. So that leads to the conclusion, the data analysis conclusion of caring about the off diagonal. And let me tell you about what that means. So if you're a GM, you're not just trying to find great talent, you're also trying to find great value. And the great value here is in the lower left quadrant. That's Curtis Martin. So Curtis Martin, by his 40 time, does not seem fast, but by his 3-cone time is fast. And not only was he fast, he had a Hall of Fame career. The conclusion is basically reached by combining two different data sets, the 40 time and the 3-cone time. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is combining data sets and the way it elevates the value of data by being able to bring together multiple pieces of data to draw a conclusion, to sort of hit the keynote. Now, in thinking about sort of drawing conclusions, I first want to acknowledge a few important trends in the data world. One, and we talk about this, and you've probably heard about it all the time, there's certainly an explosion of data volumes. You see it. There's more data being recorded in all sorts of places. There's an explosion of data professionals, people with the title data scientist, data engineer, but also people that are very adjacent to data-specific jobs that are very competent at manipulating data, ingesting data, cleaning data as part of what they do. And last, something that's not as much talked about with respect to data is the explosion of SaaS tools. So, and Mozart Data is one of those SaaS tools, but there are a number of SaaS tools where companies are generating through their customers a variety of data. And often it's how do you leverage that data in that explosion of SaaS tools. Now, typically what people do is they get exports from the SaaS tools, right? So they maybe are downloading CSV files from multiple of their different tools. They then can clean and join that data in something like Excel or G Sheets, and doing lookups to essentially connect the data sources, and ultimately get to a place of a very messy desktop. That becomes their source of truth. Now, as Sad Mozart will tell you, this is bad. It takes a lot of time, it's error prone, the data is siloed, and replication is difficult. Instead, we think of the right way of bringing together multiple data sources is building a data pipeline. And what that typically involves is creating a bunch of data in SaaS tools, databases, CSV files, extracting and loading that data into a powerful data warehouse, like a columnar, transforming and cleaning that data before using it to have automated reports in a data visualization tool. And what we think of as a data pipeline as being important is because it enables teams to basically collect their data and start analyzing it and really get the maximum value out of it. But this picture sort of infers that a data pipeline can be often a little bit confusing or tricky or difficult to build. And Mozart Data is trying to be the easiest way to spin up one of these data pipelines that we call a modern data stack. And a modern data stack, to me, is a best-in-breed solution at each of the 4 slices after those SaaS tools where you're generating that data. Now, speaking of modern data stacks, we're going to have a number of talks on them. First, Derek Steer is going to talk about the evolution of the modern data stack. Then we're going to get a customer perspective from a customer of a modern data stack, Dan Cho. Then we're going to get an investor perspective, someone who invests in modern data stacks and adjacent SaaS tools. Then we're going to go more old school. We're going to have the assistant general manager of the Twins talking about applying data to baseball decision-making. And last, my co-founder and CTO, Dan Silberman, is going to walk through the product roadmap of a modern data stack, Mozart Data's product roadmap. So with that, let me turn it over to my friend, Derek Steer, CEO of Mode Analytics. Derek.
Okay, thanks, Fish. Let me get this going. All right, is my screen up?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so my name is Derek Steer. I'm the CEO of Mode. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me. Some of this is going to sound very similar to what Fish just said. I was planning on doing a whole history of the modern data stack and then realized that my presentation was like 3 times as long as it needed to be. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about how the data stack evolved into what it is today, but really focus on some of the recommendations that I might give to folks as they are setting up data stacks. We're here at this conference, Mozart exists, my company Mode exists in large part because of the modern data stack. And there's so much innovation happening here right now. I think that we can get a lot of insight into how we might build our stacks by looking at how these things evolved in the first place. So I'm actually going to start with a slide that I've lifted directly from Fish. And I took this slide from a talk that he gave in 2014 called The Economics of Freemium. I remember this slide 7 years later because I think it perfectly highlights the value that we can get from our data technology, and it explains why the stack has evolved this way. So what you're looking at is a screenshot from the game Mobsters 2, which is a competitor to Zynga's super popular game Mafia. These are 3 items here that you're looking at for in-game purchase with real money, and each of them gives a player an advantage in competing against other players. This page has been heavily optimized, right? From the artwork to the bonuses that each item gives to pricing, all of these things have been tested endlessly to make them as appealing as possible. The same way that e-commerce companies test and iterate on their checkout flows, or SaaS companies instrument and test their sign-up flows. The reason that I'm showing you a video game is that they did one thing better than anyone else, which is that they combined their product activity data and purchasing data to design products for maximum revenue generation. And they were excellent at this. This slide is taken from that exact same talk. So thanks, Fish, for doing the hard work for me. This shows the framework that individual decision points like that previous slide get slotted into. So what you're looking at here is an end-to-end mapping of value delivery. This is users signing up for, enjoying, and then sharing these games all the way through to monetization. Looking at this slide, some parts like acquisition and virality come from product data. Revenue probably comes from another system. And then we're feeding in information from marketing systems, CRM, really a number of other places that help build out the picture. Now, in the games world, it turned out that most revenue came from whales, people who spent orders of magnitude more money than anyone else and who competed primarily with other whales. That's the kind of analysis that told gaming companies what they otherwise might not know, which is how to optimize their games to create more whales and to maximize profits from that particular group. And you can see that on this diagram, Fish actually split out the number of payers relative to the total number of active users, as well as the revenue per payer. And in this case, understanding the distribution of revenue per payer really was where the key insight came from. It's not an obvious thing. You have to kind of dig into it. But most importantly, you have to understand the entire cycle from beginning to end, from like where you even acquire these whales to what their activity looks like initially, how we can get them to take that activity, and then ultimately what gets them to keep paying. So, one of the interesting things about this is it takes a long time to get people through this entire funnel, or it can. But once you understand each step of the process, you can track what's happening in the first couple of steps and then get some sense of what is likely to happen in the later steps based on trends that you've seen. So you start by measuring all of these things, having this framework, and then you start to build these proxies early on that allow you to iterate really quickly so that you can keep changing the way you acquire users or the way that your game mechanics work, get people in and active and get this viral loop going. And then you can measure the ultimate monetization later on. In modern B2B companies like Mode, we copy a lot of this framework, right? Framework that really the gaming companies did better than anybody. Many of you have probably heard of this notion of product-led growth, and that's what you're looking at right here. This is a framework for product-led growth. So at a B2B company with a freemium model, for example, this retention and virality is what creates revenue opportunities. Right? The product is super tightly tied to revenue, right? That's why we have this concept of product-led growth. All of this is enabled by putting product and revenue data together, which starts with good storage and processing and event logging and comes together further up the stack in analytics tools like Mode. That event logging is a particularly important thing, especially with regard not only to like how you measure these things, but also to the way that the stack has evolved. And this is really the secret sauce. The thing that the best companies are doing is they're using data to create a holistic view of their business, which means tying things that happen in the product back to revenue outcomes. So I'm going to share a little bit about how this has evolved since Zynga's heyday, how the modern data stack makes this type of product understanding possible at pretty much any company, and then how to make the most of it. So back in the early aughts, the data landscape was dominated by these big monolithic all-in-one BI products like MicroStrategy, Click, Business Objects. And they were so expensive that really they were only accessible to gigantic companies. They were not only expensive to buy, but then you had to implement them. There's a lot that went into that. The same was true of any type of advanced analysis. So there were products like SaaS, SAS, that were used in risk modeling, actuarial science, that kind of thing, but certainly were not mainstream in the way that we think of data today. Then Hadoop came along, and it spurred the big data movement. Right? With Hadoop, it now became possible to track and to query and get value from massive amounts of data. And so that data came from event logging, whether it might be server logs, could be Internet of Things, like, think of like GE turbines that are throwing off tons of sensor readings every second. Could be application event data, which is what a lot of us think about when we think about our data stacks today. that's really important because that ability to use these event streams in analysis, it was the thing that those old school BI products couldn't do. And the thing that was really, really expensive to do before, that became a lot more possible. And that's really what enabled us to start understanding all the little events that happen in the product and how they tie back to revenue, right? So that big data movement enabled these event streams to even come about. Around that time, we also had the cloud movement starting too. So Hadoop became an Apache project in 2006, same year AWS launched. Now, for a few years, everyone was kind of fumbling in the dark here, trying to get Hadoop working. Cloud data tech was maturing. We didn't have like a really good solution. And in hindsight, that time from 2006 through to about 2014 was kind of just teeing us up for all of the goodness to come, right? So it was a shorter era that preceded what we now see in the modern data stack. At the same time, we also had data science as a profession starting to gain some momentum. So big companies were hiring all these analytical people however they could. Fish came from sports. I came from economic consulting. Really, people were entering this field however they could because there weren't data science programs. So the first data science program, I think, launched right around 2012, and that was at Columbia. So we now have lots of these at every major university, right? There are data science programs everywhere, but at the time, this was a new and novel thing. So as I said, all of this is kind of just paving the way for this big shift. And the thing that really changed the entire landscape was the commoditization of data storage and processing. So this came from competition among major cloud vendors, Google with BigQuery, Microsoft Azure SQL, and then dedicated folks like Snowflake, just making databases, that all drove costs way down. These products all made it really cheap to set up and maintain a data warehouse. You no longer had to host it all yourself, right? So the cost of maintaining and administering Hadoop, gone. And Amazon's low-cost strategy forced the entire cloud data warehouse market to come in at a price point way below what you would have to pay historically for something like Teradata or Vertica to get the same value. So the fact that Redshift was the earliest entrant, I don't think it's really the most popular thing anymore. We see a lot of folks going with Snowflake, at least at Mode. But it set the tone that has created a market of products that are affordable for pretty much anyone. Could be, small companies, startups. I think a lot of us here work at startups. Could be small divisions within much bigger companies. There are so many more companies that can take advantage of this today because of Amazon's initial strategy in entering this market. The reason that I'm talking about all these trends is that it all evolved around the use cases that I mentioned earlier, combining data from disparate sources in novel ways to better link product and performance. And that's what is important to think about when designing these systems and trying to get value out of them. So the market response to all of these trends has been really interesting. Maybe the most significant market response has been the shift from these big all-in-one tools to a more modular stack. And that started, by moving to Hadoop, right? Where we went from these tools like Click and MicroStrategy that did everything to using Hadoop as a storage layer. We saw companies like Datamir and Platfora build directly on top of Hadoop, with the idea being that they would solve similar problems to their BI predecessors, but that they'd plug directly in, and so Hadoop would be the central data source for the company. We also saw a lot of open source projects gaining steam at the time, things like Luigi for transformation, ingestion stuff, Kafka for event streaming. And what this amounted to was a stack that was just really, really hard to work with, because all these open source tools, they're not really well supported by vendors. Now there, of course, is a company built around Kafka, and we had some companies rise up, to provide support for Hadoop, but it was still a pretty big burden to administer all of this. And it gave that value. Like if you got it going right, you were able to put all of your data there and get this value from joining product and revenue data. But it was just only accessible to really big tech companies were the ones who were able to do this successfully. And everyone else seemed to really struggle. Then we got cloud data warehouses, right? So Redshift came in, we got BigQuery and Snowflake. They revealed themselves to be cheaper and easier to manage, and they gave rise to the rest of this ecosystem, all of which exists under this same premise. The first layer to take advantage of that was really the consumption layer. And I think, when I look at the consumption layer, obviously my company Mode sits here. I think also about the types of ways that these companies take advantage of the underlying stack. So like take Looker, for example. They have a proprietary modeling language that basically allows any of these cloud data warehouses to take the place of cubes that old monolithic BI tools were built on. So they said, we're going to do consumption and transformation, and that will allow us to, in combination with Redshift or Snowflake or BigQuery, do the job of one of these historic, big monolithic BI tools. And that's really the core innovation, is decoupling the front end of a BI app from the storage. I started Mode around the same time with the understanding that every company was going to want to do more advanced analysis, like the Zyngas of the world, and that Mode would help to make that accessible. After that consumption layer, we started to see logging, ingestion, and transformation layers fill in. So we had Segment that introduced a product that would sync events directly to Redshift. Fivetran came in and made it easy to suck data from all these SaaS apps that Fish mentioned into databases. That's really one of the key enablers here, is being able to take all of these SaaS apps you use and pull that data into one place easily. And then more recently, dbt came along and really addressed the T part of ELT, and started doing this transformation piece, forming another important piece of that connective tissue in the modern data stack. Importantly, all of these things are easy to deploy, easy to use, and are built with this stack in mind. It works really well together, which dovetails really nicely with some of the biggest feedback I have about how to get a real good use out of all of these tools. So the first thing to consider when you're building your stack or designing your stack for the next iteration is that the data warehouse is really going to be your new operational center. It's going to be the place where all of this stuff lives together. And in fact, it's the only system where it really makes sense to gather all relevant business and product data. One of the big benefits that it has is that it's not tied to any given department's operational tools. So a stack that's built around Salesforce as the primary way to store information would not only be a pain to get data into, it would also be disproportionately serving your sales team at the expense of anyone else who wanted access to that data. So one of the key features of the modern data stack is that it's department agnostic. Now, domain-specific tools are important, like Salesforce, and that's why we see products like Census that are taking data from the operational center and pushing it out to other apps. More on that in just a minute. I think there are a few implications of the data warehouse as this operational center. And the first is that you want to design the system to be as modular as possible. This is definitely an industry trend already, and it's a good one, because with such a powerful asset, you really want to be able to use it in lots of different ways. You might want to funnel data into your product. If you want recommendations in your product, you should be building those on top of this core centralized asset. If you want to do analysis directly on top of it, of course, having everything together is great. You want to push it out to other systems of record like Salesforce, as I mentioned. Really, in order to get the most out of this system, you want to be able to swap pieces in and out easily, or grant third parties access to any layer that's going to be beneficial to them. Right? So you don't want something that's really locked down. The other big implication here is that you should invest in this early and often. The earlier that you design this system deliberately, the less reworking that you're going to have to do later, and the more value you'll be able to get. After all, time spent redesigning and refactoring is time that's not spent getting the value. And some early planning can really help you to avoid that. I found that the best way to do this is just talk with experts who have seen where things go wrong and seen where things go right. Mozart Data certainly can be those people. So can Mode. There are lots of folks around who are willing to share their battle stories. One of the major advantages that we can get from the modern data stack is powerful automation. Automation is triggered based on events, which means that the quality and the quantity of your event logging is going to determine what you are capable of down the road. The best advice that I can give anyone here is to make sure that you're tracking events for any key action and that you have some rigor in your product development process for adding and verifying event logging anytime that a release goes out. The second best advice that I can give is to make sure that events are easily usable in any system that needs them. So for folks who are really early in their data maturity, a a lot of times the first thing that you'll implement is something like Google Analytics to track what's going on a website, or Amplitude or Mixpanel for an application. These are good products in that they provide value very quickly. As soon as you implement their logging, data starts flowing through. They've got pre-built dashboards and you just get something immediately. It's nice, it feels easy, it helps you. But it's really easy to lock all of your events into one of these systems as the first thing. I would strongly encourage any of you who primarily track events in a tool like this to get them out immediately. Because the sooner that you make your tracking tool agnostic, the less you're going to struggle later. I recommend Segment to basically anyone. I think it's just easy to set up. Once you have it in place, it's trivially easy to get events into any new piece of software that you might want to try, or into your centralized data warehouse. So it's the thing that offers the most flexibility down the road. This brings me to my next point, which is it's not a bad idea to pick systems based on what works well with the modern data stack. So I have a friend who recently took a job running marketing at a Series A startup. And she called me up and asked me about putting together a data stack, and in particular, which marketing automation software might work best for her company. Because events are such a critical part of marketing automation, you set all kinds of triggers like send this person an email if they've completed this particular event. Because it's so critical, and because she knew that she would also want to dispatch those events to a data warehouse, she ended up coming to the conclusion that the best plan of action would be to put Segment in place and then to pick marketing automation software by looking at the list of Segment supported vendors and evaluating them. And I think this is a really good strategy for most companies. Build a great stack of tools, great individual tools. As Fish said, you want to have best of breed tools in every place, but really the most important thing is that they fit together well with a few key elements, right? Including your data warehouse and your event logging. So having great products matters, but also making sure that everything works in exactly the way you want, it's just going to save you a lot of hassle down the road. And like I said, saving that integration time, or better yet, getting good out of the box integrations, it can really change what you're actually able to do with these tools. The downside is that you might end up getting stuck with established players, which aren't necessarily the most innovative, but have the resources to dedicate to integrating well with other folks in the stack. So Fivetran has a connector for Marketo, but not for customer IO, which I personally think is a better product in a lot of ways. That's the sort of thing that might lead me to pick an inferior product, but potentially get a superior end result, because the data integration can often matter more than the product itself, especially because we're talking about something that is so closely tied to events. This isn't always true. This is just going to be a trade-off that you have to weigh for your own company. And at the end of the day, I think for most companies, you'll find that the aggregate value of a well-functioning integrated system is greater than that of a disconnected system with a couple of great components. Finally, we should all expect new things to keep appearing as part of this modern data stack. So you heard me mention census before. It's part of a category that I don't love the name. People call it reverse ETL, because the idea is that it takes data from the warehouse and sends it out to SaaS tools instead of bringing it in from SaaS tools. Some companies call it operational analytics. This segment is just in its infancy, but it's going to grow a lot in the coming years. And one way to design with it in mind is to make sure that the things that you build in your data warehouse are portable. For example, you want to do all of your data modeling in a tool like dbt so that the model data exists in the warehouse for anyone to access. Right? If you're doing modeling in a downstream layer, like in your BI tool, it's not going to be available for products like Census when you want to use them. Another category that's coming up quickly is data testing and monitoring, or data observability. Big Eye, Anomalo, and Monte Carlo are some of the companies to watch in this space. And I don't think this is something that you necessarily need to design around, but you should plan to implement one as part of your stack. When you do, you'll want to consider which things are most important to test. So my recommendation is to come up with SLAs for your most important metrics, for things that need to be perfectly accurate, like revenue reporting. Make sure that you have excellent testing and that your team is committed to fixing problems right away. For less important things, before implementing tests, you should consider what will happen when they fail. right? Will you fix them? Will that just serve as notification for your users to not trust the data? This is really going to determine the scale of resourcing that you apply to data quality, so be deliberate. The more that we rely on our data warehouse for all operational things, the more it matters that data is correct. So make sure that you treat this with the same level of rigor that you put into actually getting data into your warehouse in the first place. And again, while the products in these categories are still in their infancy, you should be prepared to take advantage. You should budget for them. You should expect to take time to implement them as they mature. So I want to wrap this up by reminding you all what spurred these innovations in the first place. The value that we get by combining data from disparate sources and looking at the big picture is really what this is all about. So if you're building your data stack now, you should plan out how you will get that specific type of value, right? What your use cases are. And then, as I mentioned, you should build a stack that fits very well and works well together and achieves those specific use cases. The good news is that the initial building blocks are pretty standardized at this point. So if you follow the well-worn path, you're going to reap outsized benefit as the rest of the stack matures around it. Just keep an eye on where you want to end up so that you get the specifics right. Again, I'm Derek Steer. I'm the CEO of Mode. You can reach me at the links here. On Twitter, I'm at Derek Steer or derek@mode.com. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, everyone enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Derek. How's it going, everyone? I'm Dylan Mullaney. I'm the head of sales here at Mozart Data. Really appreciate everyone joining us today. I'm excited to announce our next presenters. It's one of our first customers, Dan Cho of Tempo, as well as one of our engineers here at Mozart Data, Kritika Dusad.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm so excited to talk to Dan Cho today. He's the Senior Director of Operations at Tempo, one of our early customers, as Dylan mentioned. Thanks for being here, Dan.
Yeah, of course. Pleasure to be here.
So during a pandemic, Tempo has been one of the most relevant companies out there. Can you explain what Tempo does?
Yeah, Tempo is an at-home fitness company, hardware, software. We have personalized form feedback and workout plans. And yeah, the goal is to really help spread the ability for people to make fitness a key part of their life at home.
Great. So this takes me to my next question. What's the role of data at Tempo and how are you using it innovatively?
Yeah, so I joined when the company was 15 people and not much had been created. I wanted data to be at the very core of how we built out our operations, how we made decisions. And I know a lot of companies say this, and I've been at a few companies before coming to Tempo. So for me, the important thing was I really wanted the stewards of data to be the people who were closest to it. And I'd worked with Dan Silberman at Clover, and we had spent a lot of time thinking about this topic. And when I came to Tempo, that's what I kind of went to him first, asking him what made sense for Tempo. And that's actually how we kind of started that partnership. So it really led to this alignment on wanting analysts, the people who are close to the operating teams, but then also the ones who get asked the business questions, who then have to then do all the work to really bring the data to life and make it part of your operating culture. So, I wouldn't say that we do anything like innovative that people haven't heard of, but we do it in a way that directionally gets us to a place where we hopefully don't have to caveat so much when we say, like, here's this number, here's this dashboard, here's the insight. There's no coordination costs around, okay, well, there's something wrong with the data, let me go figure it out. And then you have to then work with a data engineering team, or you have to translate to another stakeholder. So you kind of just consolidate a lot of the data stewardness into one person. And that really empowers them to really enable the company to, I think, be truly data-driven. So that's how we do it.
That's great. That's great. I guess, can you also talk about the growth of Tempo during COVID era, and how has your role in operations changed since you started?
So my role specifically has changed quite a bit. I'm also the chief of staff to the CEO, and I think that's the one that drives a lot of my day to day. So in the very beginning, because we were 15 people and nothing existed, and we were still Series A. So it's been sort of this combination of fundraising, which we've done 3 times in the past 18 months, and building out teams. So, I think in the very beginning, it was deep in the supply chain logistics and customer support, creating those teams, and then would just kind of do what I could on the finance, biz ops, HR people, things like that. And now that we've gone to 220 people, it's been this firefighting journey of aggressive hiring, helping support people be successful in the roles that we bring them on for. And as you can imagine, things change every week. When you're adding on new people, the business is scaling really fast. And for us as a consumer company, it's cyclical. So this is now like kind of our first year as a company. So every quarter has just been a very different set of problems that we've had to solve, and they've all been new for us. So it's not been the same, pretty much.
No, but that's great. Like, it's very interesting time for Tempo. And there's so many startups, so many big companies, small companies that build their own data pipelines. But what made you choose Mozart Data versus building something on your own?
There's a couple of things. I think in the very beginning when I joined, mind melded with the CEO. Like, how does he think about the business? He's at the very core super cost conscious in thinking in the short term and long term. So that honestly drove the first questions of like, who do we need to be, like, who are the critical hires for this company? When it came to data, there was this balance that I was trying to strike with, I really want us to be data driven, but I need to figure out how we scale this company while still with just Series A funding. And this sort of then cut off that path of, I think companies, when at this stage and nothing exists, they hire data science, data engineers. They just hire all these data people to go solve problems. And I was like, that's not going to really work for us. And I suspect that it's not how we have to do things. And so, with those conversations with Dan, that kind of led to what he was thinking about in his head and how that made a lot of sense to me. And, we very quickly got to a place where I could just set everything up. It took about 4 hours on a Saturday. And I showed that to the founder and was like, hey, right, like with this tool, with some pretty basic SQL skills, I can get us to a pretty good place. And then if we hire a few people with really strong, operating backgrounds and good SQL skills, they can actually take this really far for us and scale pretty quickly. And super cost efficient, right? Basic math of just looking at headcount of how companies would typically build this out, and the model that we could create with Mozart, and just the benefits of having really strong control, centralized control over that. It was just like a no-brainer for us.
That's great to hear. And Tempo has grown so much, and it's nice that Mozart has also been there with you during that time. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about like some specific data challenges that you faced, that could be specific to Tempo or the operations team that were addressed by Mozart Data.
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges for especially early stage companies is you're creating teams and functions net new really fast. And I think the question that we ask every time a new function, a new process, a new tool is brought on is, what are we, like, do we need to track that? Do we need to know if it's working? not all the time, but most of the time, yes, you want to be tracking those things. At some point, some exec is going to ask what is happening and is it good? And with Mozart, we get ahead of it, right? I know that we're going to be implementing certain tools. I know this team is going to start existing. What are the questions that they're going to want to be asking? So therefore, that data source, we should probably be thinking about how to connect it and how that's all going to be centralized. And some of these cross-functional questions that we want to be able to answer that require you to be thinking about how you're collecting, organizing, structuring, and then utilizing that data is you have to start early. And when that's sort of at the core of how you're standing up these teams, then you do sort of end up in the place where you want to be, where the questions that get asked, you're like, yep, I've already sort of thought about it from a data side, so I can get you there. Maybe not 100% of the way, but 80, 90%. And the rest of it is just the work in progress that is inherent in when you're moving this fast.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yep.
So, a lot of companies have customers, they have customer data, they have, other sorts of data related to their products. Can you give an example of a specific, maybe problem or dashboard that you had to build or that the team had to work on, and how, Mozart Data was used there?
Yeah, so I think the first dashboard I pushed the team to prioritize was our executive dashboard, just metrics across supply chain, marketing, customer support. That was our first attempt to really show the value to the executive team and everyone at the company that if this weren't centralized, we'd have to be doing this in spreadsheets and maintaining it would be a nightmare. But look, there's a one, click the button and you can see all the metrics. Mozart was super critical, and it took the burden of trying to get everything centralized off the plate, and then just left the work of, okay, the data's there, we just have to start messing with it and get it to a place that will really power this dashboard. The product data itself, I think this is where Mozart solves part of the problem, and I didn't expect it to solve the data reliability piece. So the early engineers who set up our the product infrastructure, there wasn't any QA happening on whether all the events were firing and how they were being labeled and any of that. So there's only so much you can do right on Mozart post, if the data itself at the core is flawed. But in the very early phases, at least it was centralized, right? At least it was connected to our customer support data. At least it was linked up with Shopify and the e-commerce and all of that. So there was we could start to answer these questions and still be in the place of caveating, but we understood that was a problem that we were going to be really understanding and then solving. So, I mean, without Mozart, it would have been spreadsheets. I would have been a nightmare. I'd have been very annoyed, to be honest. So it put us in a really good place pretty early.
That's great. Thank you so much for, sharing your experiences and your knowledge about, not just operations, but how you're using data and the challenges that you've faced. Thanks for coming here. Back to you, Dylan.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan and Kritika. Up next, we'll have our second Q&A session. I'm excited to introduce one of our investors, Shruti Ghandi, who is the managing partner and founder of Array Ventures, as well as one of our own data analyst, Adam Pharr.
Thank you, Dylan. And thank you, Shruti, for joining us. Shruti, she there? Seems like Shruti hasn't shown up yet, but there you are. Hey, Shruti, how's it going?
There you go. I'm trying to learn Zoom.
All good, all good.
The pandemic.
No, it's an ongoing learning process. It always has been. Well, thanks for joining us. Just so everyone knows, Shruti is general partner and founder at Array Ventures and is one of Mozart's first investors. Thanks again for joining us. Let's start off with a little bit about your background, your career before you started investing, and then sort of how and why you decided to start Array.
Yeah, thanks for first of all having me. I love that you're putting this conference together. I'm learning a lot. My quick background was I was an engineer for a decade, worked on all sorts of data problems, location-based services, voice for IP, and many other things. Then went on to start a company also in the big data world at the time. That was 10 plus years ago. And then about 10 years ago, got into venture. So I've been working at a few firms. I helped start Samsung's investment arm. And then I was at a firm called True Ventures, and about 6 years ago started Array. The idea with Array is exactly what you guys are working on, that the world hasn't caught up to being able to manage and work with all the data that they are producing and making them more of an intelligent enterprise company that is going to be valuable in the future, versus just like an automation workflow or something like that, right? So that is what we invest in. We like being first check investors in companies such as Mozart, and I'm so excited to be part of the journey with you all and answer any questions you have.
Yeah, cool. So I mean, I feel like you have a unique perspective as being both a founder and an investor. Like, what knowledge from your founding career do you bring to your investment strategy? Like, what do you sort of like empathize with more because you've been a founder?
That's a good question. I think there is a lot. I think the one part that I really wanted to get into venture for was to reverse engineer the founder journey. And so the next time I went to go start a company, it was going to be the perfect way to go start a company and just go, up and to the right and things like that. What in reality is that's not the case, is what you learn, right? In reality, there's a lot of ups and downs. It's not just one directional. And every company has a different playbook that they execute. So I think that's been something that I appreciate working with my founders on. And then there are more softer side of things. Oftentimes, being a founder is a lonely job, and you're getting a lot of different advice. You're getting told many different things that all make sense actually, but you can't figure out which one of it, should be your strategy moving forward. And it all feels so important because each decision you make costs company a lot of money, reduces your burn, may or may not lead to the outcome you're looking for, and may or may not lead to the outcome the investor is looking for, even if it's the outcome you may be looking for. So it's so hard. And you have to make this, by the way, you have to make 10, 20 of those decisions like every week, if you will. So I think those are the things I love working with our founders on, and I can relate to well with the I call it my founder family, and oftentimes it's friends that I also invest with. So I'm lucky to be able to have friends and family, friends and founders all in the same bucket of people I can call and hang out with as well.
Yeah. So Array primarily invests in data and SaaS companies, right?
Yes.
What are some of the biggest challenges you see with startups, with data and SaaS startups, like early stage ones?
The biggest challenges are, there's a few, but the biggest challenges is oftentimes how you maximize the dollar that you have raised. I think there is a lot of ways you can spend the capital. There's always people. There's always marketing versus sales kind of decisions to make, right? Do I hire the next sales head, AE, SDR, content marketer? I mean, ideally you want everyone.
Right.
Ideally, right? Ideally, that's what you need. You want to hire everyone so you can just, I mean, you just know what they all need to do. So it's really hard to make those decisions, and with the limited amount of resources you have. And even if you have the capital, um, it's not, I mean, you could hire 15 people, but was it an effective decision to hire a head of sales when your product is not up to date for them to sell, right? So there is a lot of figuring out and stacking things in the right order, that we oftentimes help our founders think about, because this is actually very similar kind of issues a lot of founders face at this stage, which is the first check stage I'm talking about, right? Like the first few
Yeah.
pre-series A, or pre-series B even. So
Yeah, those are a lot of the problems that we've been facing ourselves, especially on the hiring side, like, where to sort of focus the resources. So we've been in coronavirus for a little over a year now, and doing lots of stuff on Zoom. But what have you seen play out in the investing world in that time? Like, what is stuff that what happened that you expected, and what happened that you didn't expect?
Well, on what front? I would say, like, on the investing front, something interesting happened, which we'd already been doing, but investing in founders before you meet them personally was a big change on the investment side, and making decisions, for large checks without meeting people in person. Because I think, as we know in our world, sales was affected in a similar way. A
Right.
customer would never want to sign a large contract without meeting you in person. And not only, I can't say that changed all the way, but it has. People, the expectations have been different. But also, you're realizing, like, I don't need to meet you 5 other times to make a decision, right? I think so. The sales cycle actually. So I'll finish the investment side. The investment side, that became critical. The investors started to figure out how to do that, and have board meetings faster, to make such decisions happen, and change their processes around that. And everyone's I would say still figuring that out, because now we're coming into this hybrid world soon as well. On the startup side, the big thing that happened was, sales motions changed. I think sales motion became, uh, in some ways, better, but unpredictable. Like, the whole thing we had about the bottom up versus the enterprise strategies are kind of merging. In pre-pandemic, I would have said something like, you have to pick one. You can't go after a 250K contract and a 10K contract all at the same time, or a $500 per month. Any of those, they're all like different spectrums of what you charge for and how you approach the sales motion around those. But what has changed is there's some sort of a merger of go-to-market happening in some ways right now in the market, which is, you are going after a playbook, which is gathering email addresses, doing drip campaigns, approaching the customer in different ways, starting them off on different smaller contracts, upselling them faster than a year. I mean, these are all things that are shifting, and they were done by some companies in some shape or form before, but now this is becoming like status quo.
Yeah, totally.
Because this is the only way to go. I'm not going to be able to close a 250K contract with someone on Zoom. It's just hard. And at the same time, I cannot do 10K contracts and take 6 months. So all this needs to happen within a reasonable amount of time. So sales cycles are shortening in some ways for the smaller contract sizes, and then upsells are happening faster than a year. So I think that's becoming, and all of that requires a different playbook of how you spend on sales versus marketing. And the third category that's becoming big in my books is community. So you guys are doing something similar here for your community right now. And it's a very important category that is growing in how you're able to effectively sell to your customers, and also especially the early customers, make them your champions.
Yeah.
So
What are some like unique ways that you've seen community building during COVID?
I have been telling this to a lot of people, but my thesis is people are looking generally for a place to I would say go worship in many ways. You're you know it's there's for many reasons folks are visiting or like they're finding less places to go hang out in a social circle today. Maybe they're less religious or whatever it is, and so that is creating a gap for them in their social lives to find ways to connect with other people. And so I think companies have a lot of opportunities to serve for that gap, because what is ending up happening is people are working harder and harder now because they care about that a lot more.
Yeah.
I care a lot about what I'm building at my venture firm, and I don't think about it as work. So that has led me to now want to connect with people that are like-minded, and that like-minded people end up being in tech and venture. And so that is, if there's a community for people that are like-minded to you, to your customers, that are hanging out, that are hanging out in a place to solve problems together, which I think excites all of us, right, in many ways. I think those are the kinds of communities that thrive, and there are some companies that have done that pretty well today.
Yeah, I've seen some in like Slack. They're a little bit more like business oriented, I guess, and then like also like something like Discord, where it's like a little bit more fun and people interacting in different ways.
I think there's a lot of big communities that have been formed in like the crypto world today, and
right.
I think it's just beginning to happen in the data tech world. So there's a lot to learn from that world as well.
Yeah, well, so speaking of investments during COVID, let's talk a little bit about how or why Ray decided to invest in Mozart.
Simple answer. I've known Pete and as Fish as he goes by, and there is no way I was not going to invest in Mozart. It is what he's working on is something that I have been excited about for a while, but at the same time, the team. I mean, he's working with someone he's worked with together. The bacon hot sauce. I mean, that's
Yes.
there's many social reasons as to why I've done this, and Pete and team and Dan know the space well. I mean, they've been in the space from early days at Yammer and Open Door and Ease, and right, like there's been issues that they've faced around this, and I wouldn't say there's any other team that knows how to go solve this problem today. So I'm excited to back them and just be part of the journey and be available as necessary, which but as a friend or as part of an investment group of people here.
Yeah, and once again, you can sort of bring your founder perspective and help us in that way. So of course, we're very thankful that you've decided to invest in Mozart. But so just like to wrap it up here, what are some trends you're seeing in the data and SaaS industry? Like what do you expect to play out in the next few years?
So as I said, the go-to-market motion is changing, and so the whole ecosystem of companies that serve a new go-to-market motion is changing. So we, one of the big theses I have, for example, is because of short sales cycles and because of rapid customer adoption of your tools, churn is also becoming normal and part of the game, right? I mean, the customer that wanted to try your product but then couldn't engage with it can easily churn tomorrow, and you're probably focused more on higher contract sizes. And so as an early team, it's really hard to do that and customer success and everything all well. So for that reason, the long tail customer success category is growing. Being able to touch the customers you cannot physically or digitally connect with one-on-one is a pain point, for example, that I think companies will have to tackle well. And so one of our recent investments that I've made is in that category. It's a company called Cast.app. We have some other areas that we invest. We usually put out like areas we're excited about. So I wrote a blog post about that recently, a few months ago, on 11 things that we're looking to invest in. They span on everything from security, compliance, API tools management, log management. So we've actually been checking off a lot of those categories, and I've made investments in those spaces. But there are still some open areas. I'm still looking for like a community management platform because I believe community is the future. So, and it's really hard to just put people at that problem, right? So
Yeah.
tools that can handle those kinds of things is what I'm looking for as well.
Cool. And do you see much momentum there, or is it just like non-existent?
Do I see what?
Some like momentum there with the community stuff, or yeah?
Yeah. I mean, there's actually there's two ways to look at it. The open source guys have always had a community, and now there's actually a new generation of companies coming up that are more open source first, and creating an enterprise grade product. And so they are definitely also creating tools. There have been companies that have come up as well that manage and help manage some of those communities.
Cool. Well, thank you, Shruti, for joining us. And I am going to kick it back to Dylan.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Shruti and Adam. You all might have heard Shruti mention bacon hot sauce. So this Mozart Data is actually the second company that Dan and Fish have founded. Their first company was a bacon hot sauce company, which is pretty funny. I also wanted to remind everybody that we will be hosting a Clubhouse after party with our partner High Touch when the conference concludes. We sent everybody a Eventbrite email right before the conference started, and it does have a link to the Clubhouse in there. We'll also send everybody a link in the chat afterwards as well, and we'd love to see you all there. Next up, we're going to have a small change in the schedule, and we're going to be introducing Dan Silberman, who is our CTO and co-founder.
Hi, thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. So today we've heard a lot about modern data stacks and how different companies are using them to answer important questions about their business or improve their operations. So I'm going to be doing a walkthrough to show Mozart Data, show how we're helping companies quickly and easily take their data to this next level, and talk a little bit about where we're headed in the future. So I'm going to share my screen and my Zoom stuff. So at a high level, our goal is to be the easiest way for data analysts, data scientists, data engineers to get access to the benefits of working in what we've been talking about as a modern data stack, as well as opening up the power to I would say, this growing class of person who might not call themselves a data analyst or data scientist or engineer, but who are using data more and more to do their jobs better, who may have picked up SQL skills along the way, people who will often have titles like sales ops, marketing ops, finance ops, or folks in product. So, okay, to hop into the demo, under the hood, we are managing a Snowflake data warehouse for all of our customers. So when you get a fresh Mozart Data account, this page is mostly empty, as this is sort of the menu of your warehouse. So I'm gonna actually hop into connectors as the first thing on the left-hand chart that Pete shared earlier is kind of getting your data in. So step one for pretty much everybody is get some data into your warehouse. So these are the data sources we currently support. Each one of these is kind of a different integration, but we go to great lengths to make it as simple as possible. Some of our more common ones are Shopify, Salesforce is pretty common. Most companies have some sort of MySQL, Postgres database that they're using at their application layer. Google Ads, Facebook Ads, a lot of companies running, half of operations running off of Google Sheets. And, Facebook Ads, Google Ads, and like I was saying, the power really comes when you start to combine different data sources. So a couple examples, like Derek was talking about customer acquisition cost. For a lot of folks, that would be a combination of, Facebook ads, Google ads, plus maybe your Stripe data, or however you're storing kind of the actual value that you're getting out of each customer. Or at Mozart, we're using Segment for our product analytics, and then we're combining that with our Salesforce data to ultimately give a report to our sales team so they can see how current customers and how prospective customers are using the product, so they can cater their outreach based on that. So as far as roadmap goes, you can see we have a lot of coverage right now. We're always adding more of these. In particular, I wanted to call out that we're integrating a technology called Singer Taps, which is an open source protocol for building ETL pipelines. So by integrating that, we'll be able to rapidly expand this list, make adding future connectors easier, and including those built by the community. So that's kind of step one for pretty much everybody. Bring your data in. I'm going to talk about data governance a little bit more later, but I did want to call out some questions we get on these a lot of the time is, can you control the data that's coming in? So just wanted to point out that for a lot of different connectors, you can like choose which data we're actually pulling in. You can anonymize columns. You can say, don't pull in this column, things like that. So there's a lot of power that we go to great lengths to hide behind kind of a simple interface. So that's step one. And then once you've connected some data, you'll have something in this, which is effectively the menu of your database. So that Shopify connector that we have is now being replicated into the Shopify schema and these tables. That application database is being replicated into this web public schema and these tables. So we have some pretty straightforward features here. You can export anything as a CSV or directly into Google Sheets. But like I was saying, the real power comes from combining data sources and organizing your data into more usable tables. And for that, we have transforms. So I'm going to open one of these as an example. So this looks similar to most BI tools. In our little demo query here, we've got one table of iOS events, another table of Android events. We're kind of reshaping that data so that we can combine it together and filter out test accounts. So sort of the standard data cleaning and reorganizing sort of work that an analyst will do. And it's nice that you can do this within Mozart. You could do this within any BI tool. But if everybody is doing this every time that they want to run some analysis on events, you end up with, some people will forget to filter out test accounts, or they'll organize this data a little bit differently. And then you have different sources of truth. You end up with different caveats, like Dan Cho was explaining earlier, on why this data isn't what it's expected to be. So a core design principle of ours is that as long as you know SQL, you should be able to have access to the features that people have been describing all day as a modern data stack. And so that means being able to schedule these data transformations. So you don't need to know Python, you don't need to manage servers or anything like that. If you can, use our pretty simple web interface, you can say, hey, I want this transformation to run every 6 hours, and that'll create this table called fact events. So I'll demo. So now, because this has already been run, we can do just query this table, and we get the benefits of all of that work that some data analysts put to kind of make the core source of truth of what do we mean by our events data. And then the rest of the features around transforms that we have so far are basically designed to help people understand their data. So we have some annotating features and help debug when there's a problem. So this has been running fine. If there was an error, you could easily see it in the chart. You'll get an alert. We show the error. You can take a look at like the change history. So you don't have to manage like GitHub integration or anything like that. You can just see, oh, this transform started breaking 2 days ago. What happened? Oh, Bob made these changes. Okay, great. We can go in and try to fix it. Talk about lineage in a second. So this is basically, going back to design principle, you should be able to build data pipelines. You should be able to organize your data if all you know is SQL. So here's just kind of quick example of like a pipeline. We have this straightforward query, not much going on here, but that's because it's downstream of this fact events transform where all the action of like, don't forget to filter out test accounts and how do we combine these two tables as organized. So we can see that by looking at the data lineage. So we can see here, this is the transform we're looking at right now, this daily active users, and we can see, oh, it came from these three tables, and then it became organized in this fact events transform, and then now we are here. And on non-demo data, sometimes these charts can get really big and very helpful to understand how data is flowing from your different SaaS tools on the far left, all the way to your core tables and maybe intermediate tables that are also useful for other folks. And one thing I would like to call out that I'm very proud of the team on for this, if you noticed, a lot of other tools to build pipelines like this, you'll have to tell them, hey, I want this to be downstream from this, I want this to be downstream from that. All of this happened, all we did is write SQL, core design principle, all you need to do is know SQL. So if you write SQL, we know your SQL, we know where all your data is coming from initially, so we can infer these charts for you. And to briefly talk on the roadmap for these transforms, or better organizing these as pipelines, so you can define, this is the marketing pipeline, this is the finance, this is the product analytics pipeline. Some more ways to annotate your data. So when you have a transform, letting you basically make comments or descriptions of each column. And then some stuff around data validation. So Dan Cho was talking about, this isn't in Mozart yet, but it is coming. So this is basically the ability to say, if distinct users is ever less than 20, send us an alert because something went wrong, or if this column ever has nulls, or if this column is ever not distinct, then we know something must have gone wrong. Don't do the transform, send us an alert. And the other piece I wanted to mention on this, going back to data governance. So a common problem that occurs kind of once your data maturity or data usage across the company reaches a certain point is you need to limit the access that different teams or different people can have access to. And right now, if you were to do that, it's a full-time job on the the DBA team or the data engineering team to manage different permissions on different schemas and different tables and different columns. So we're working on basically designing a nice, easy to use interface to both see what are the different permissions on different schemas and create new ones of those without having to write a bunch of like SQL DBA grant commands. We'll just handle all that for you. One other feature I wanted to hop back in on the warehouse page, because I think this kind of does a good job of explaining sort of how we're thinking about the problem overall. So we have this thing called snapshots. So there's a few different things people mean when they talk about snapshotting data. For us, here's an example where we have this Shopify table, this inventory level table. So we're pulling the inventory counts out of Shopify. In this case, I think it's set up to update every hour or something. So this table will always represent, the current state of your inventory. But what you often want is like to be able to track the history of inventory over time, to basically auto-generate like an events table off of what is currently just a current state table. So engineering teams the world over are building this feature for their data teams, but it doesn't really have anything specific to do to that company's data needs or the structure of that data. So we've built it as just, if you can toggle this on, then we'll create a snapshot of this table, which means you'll get a table in this other snapshot schema, which will basically be will append the original table to the end of your snapshots table so that you can then do something like make an inventory by day transform, which is very straightforward. The demo data doesn't change all that much, but this is one row per day, the inventory of each item. So I think that's a good example. Using some creativity, it ends up being more useful than it seems. But I think it's a good example of the sort of functionality that we're building that has nothing to do with any specific type of data, but is just universally useful for anybody who's organizing their data in a system like this. So, at high level, Mozart Data helps you get data in with connectors. helps you organize and categorize and annotate your data once it's in your data warehouse. And then the final step is usually hooking up some sort of a BI tools to empower the rest of the company, whether that's Mode, Tableau, and Looker are some of our most popular ones, just straight exporting to Excel throughout the application will let you move data directly into Google Sheets. And I'll show a quick demo of just kind of the final stage of this is, here's some very trivial queries because they've been organized within Mozart as transformations to clean them up into more of the core tables that anybody in the org should be able to answer questions about. So that's a bit of where we are and where we're headed. One thing I wanted to add that's difficult to demo, but I do consider a core part of the product. We pride ourselves on our above and beyond customer support. So shout out to Adam, who spoke earlier, and the rest of that team. We consider ourselves partners in the data journey with our customers. So for anyone in the audience who isn't yet using Mozart Data, you can sign up for a free trial at mozartdata.com and get started right away, or schedule a demo, and we're happy to talk to you about your data journey, what you're doing now, any problems you're facing, whether or not that might involve Mozart Data in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I hope everybody at home is enjoying their snack magic boxes. I'm excited to introduce our last speaker of the day, who is the Assistant General Manager of the Minnesota Twins, Dan Adler.
Thank you very much, Dylan, and I'm excited to speak to this group. So excited, in fact, that I am missing our game. We are tied in the bottom of the ninth. In order to not go nuts, either happy or sad, I've turned it off. And if I hear the roar of the crowd, I'm in the stadium right now. You'll know what happened. But I think that highly of Fish that I'm taking the time to talk to this group during our game. So let me share my screen here. All right, so I'm here, little different, little less technical presentation than the last group, but I'm here to talk about decision making in life and sports. And so I'm going to start with the decision in my own life. So this is a picture of a flight. This is a picture from the seat back of a flight I took not that long ago. I started off in Boston and was flying to MSP. As you can see, we circled around MSP for a while, and then the captain came on the overhead speaker and said, "Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to land tonight." Everybody lets out a huge groan. He says, "We're going to Chicago." And so not a very long flight to Chicago. Thankfully, we had enough fuel to get there. And so we land in Chicago. It's very snowy. The roads are not particularly good. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get back to Minneapolis? How am I going to get home? I had just missed a day of work. I wanted to get back. I didn't want to spend the night in Chicago. And so with the airport closed, I was faced with the decision. I could just hang out at the airport overnight. I could take a bus. I could drive. And so I looked it up. I looked up the drive, and it's, normally at a decent time, it's kind of 5.5, 6 hours. I knew it was going to take longer because of the snow. And so I thought, driving doesn't seem like such a bad idea. I could at least get in tonight and not have to deal with this anymore. And so then after I made this decision, first decision, okay, I'm going to drive. The next decision is how am I going to do this, right? I just rent a car and go myself. And I start looking around and I see some other people at the airport that are faced with the same decision and or same problem. And I overhear a guy next to me saying, "Yeah, I think I'm going to drive." And I start thinking, well, you know what? Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to have some company on the road. So maybe I would be maybe I should carpool with this guy. And so I look him over. And I'm making the decision to now get in the car with a complete stranger and potentially drive, 6-ish hours with him. And I look him over and I see he's got a Toomey suitcase, nice bag. He's got an iPhone. He looks like he's in pretty good shape. I put all that information into my gut, the original decision-making apparatus, and I decide that he might be a decent road trip partner. It probably could work out pretty well. Now, of course, all of these things, all the biases that I have, all the pieces of information I was using to make this decision also lead to a character that some people here may recall from the movie American Psycho. And of course, we know how that person turned out, and he killed a lot of people. So I would say my decision there was really not a great one. The information that I took in and what I turned that into, not the best decision that I made. And so when I look back at that decision, fortunately, I made it to Minneapolis safely. I was not murdered. My wife was mildly terrified that I made the call to get in the car with a complete stranger. Fortunately, it worked out reasonably well. But when I think about decisions, both before and after, I try to put everything on this 2x2 matrix. I don't have a tattoo. If I did, this is exactly what I would get. And so on the one axis, we see process. We can have good process or bad process. On the other axis, we see outcome. We can have a good outcome or a bad outcome. And so if we have good process, good outcome, we'd call that deserved success. If we have good process, bad outcome, that's a bad break. I would say the Minnesota Twins, our season this year has not gotten off to a good start, and hopefully we're in that bad break box rather than the bad outcome, bad process box, which is poetic justice. And then bad process, good outcome is what we would call dumb luck. And so I would say my decision, looking back, that decision to carpool, that definitely falls in the dumb luck category. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about different things that get in the way of good decision making, and ultimately how we can potentially use data to overcome some of those problems that can keep us in the good process part of this diagram. So to start, we're going to talk about Fish's alma mater, Duke University here. And if you're a basketball fan, you probably recognize this is not a homeless encampment, although many people in the Bay Area have probably seen similar situations. This is what's called Krzyzewskiville at Duke University. And this is where students camp out in order to get tickets for their games. For big games, students will actually live in tents for days and I think sometimes even weeks. So these are very intense basketball fans. And an economist named Dan Ariely, who I'm sure many people here are familiar with, took this as a good opportunity to run a little social psychology experiment. And so the experiment he did was he was looking at these intense basketball fans and saying, how much would they value tickets to the game? These are people who have been camping out for weeks. And what he did was he looked at people who, he asked students who've been camping out, he said, how much would it be if you just barely missed out on getting tickets? So that's that empty-handed person. So you were basically the last person in line who just missed out, or the first person in line who just missed out. And he asked those people, how much would you pay to get tickets to this upcoming game? It was a Duke versus North Carolina game. So really big game. These are intense fans. And he said, how much would you pay? And those people said, on average, their bid was $170. So that's a lot of money for college students. These are, poor college students. And they said, I would pay up to, on average, $170 for these tickets. Then he asked the people who were just ahead of them in line, who just barely got the tickets, hey, you just got tickets, how much would you sell them for? And that group, on average, the asking price was $2,400. So we have this incredibly large gap between the people who just missed out on getting the tickets and the people who just got them. Now, in terms of the population, those populations should really be just about the exact same. They were both camping for the same amount of time. They all go to Duke. They're all basketball fans. So what exactly is happening here that's making these people who just barely got the tickets value them so much higher? And Ariely and his colleagues and many other people in the world of behavioral economics refer to this effect as the endowment effect, and it's also sort of a subset of loss aversion. But the general concept is we start with something, our endowment, what we have, and anything less we view as a loss. And the most important part is that losses are much more painful than gains are pleasurable. So the people who have the tickets, they view that ticket as their endowment. And in order to lose that ticket, they would require a ton of money to compensate themselves. And so that person is in this very steep part of the curve that we see in the loss domain. And so when they lose out, it's really, really painful. Versus the person in the gain domain, the person who doesn't have the ticket, they say, yeah, it would be nice to attend that game. I would definitely enjoy it. And they see it as like, yeah, it would be pretty good, but you know, we could go either way. And so this concept, you know, this is a somewhat contrived example, but it's something that comes up in you know, so many different facets of life. So one of the areas that we see this a lot in baseball is what's called the infield shift. And I'm not sure of how big of baseball fans we have here, but if not, you're probably not enjoying this talk that much. But if you are, or if you're a mild fan, you may be familiar with the concept of how we position our infielders around the diamond. Traditionally, we have 4 infielders whose job is to basically stop the ball and hopefully throw the runner out at first. Historically, we would position 2 players on each side of second base relatively evenly. However, the data indicates that players are much more likely to pull the ball. And so for the right-handed batter in the video on the left, that means he's much more likely to hit it down to the third base side. And so teams have started to very frequently put three fielders on one side and 1 fielder on the other. And so what happens when you do this, on average, you make many more plays. However, there are times where you miss out on plays that you, quote, would have made if you had been in a regular formation. And so that regular formation, in a lot of ways, is kind of that endowment effect. And so if you look, I've got an example. This was, I think, the Twins' 2019 season. Our data indicated that there were 17 times where we had bad outcomes because of shifts. And those times could be very, very painful. I'm going to show one video here.
Since the inception, there's a bouncing ball through the shift. A base hit. Yelich is going to turn and head to third base.
So I'm not sure if people could hear the video, but the announcer immediately says bouncing ball through the shift. It's very clear. It's very frustrating. And generally people who are old school in baseball say this is why you shouldn't shift. Now that happened in our season 17 times where the shift cost us. However, we also had 39 times where the shift actually helped us make a play we would not have otherwise. So I'm going to play that one.
Find a way to get them all. The 1-2 up the middle.
So that second video, if we hadn't been shifted, if we hadn't had a player really directly behind second base, which is not the norm, we would not have made that play. So usually you would say anything that's happening 39 times that's working out well for you and 17 times where it's going poorly, that should be something you really want to do. But because of loss aversion, the gut feeling and the gut interpretation of that for many, many people in baseball who are less data driven is that this is a really bad idea. I don't like the shift. And in particular, when we're talking about those people, we're often talking about the pitchers themselves who can get very, very frustrated. So we've talked about some things that have gotten in the way, how loss aversion and endowment, the endowment effect can really matter. Now we're going to move to another area of bias that can create bad process. So this diagram, which a lot of people have probably seen before, shows organ donation rates by country. These are all countries, different countries in Europe, and we have a set of countries in blue where the organ donation rates are quite high, at least 86%. And then we have a set of countries in gold where they are quite low, maxing out, below 28%. And so the question, and usually if I'm delivering this to an audience where there's an interactive portion, kind of ask, what are the different theories that could be driving these major differences between European countries. When you look at the countries themselves, they generally seem to be pretty similar culturally, or at least they have analogs in the high or low group. And so what is driving these different organ donation rates? Ultimately, we guess around for a little while, and the difference is how these countries are asking the question. How do they get people to sign up to become organ donors? And in the countries who are in blue that have these really high rates, in the countries that are in gold, they are asking people to opt in to become organ donors. They're saying, check this box if you want to participate in the organ donor program. What happens? People don't check the box, they don't join. For the countries in blue, just the opposite. They say, check this box if you do not want to participate in the organ donor program. What happens? People don't check the box and they end up joining. Are people just lazy and don't like checking boxes? Maybe. There's maybe some element of that. But a lot of it is that many people will take whatever is sort of the default as some type of suggestion and more or less just be content with it. And this has been found in many facets of life, whether it's major decisions like 401k contributions. Major decisions are really influenced by whatever that default option is. Now, in my life, I think about this in the world of sports. Before I joined the Twins, I worked in football. I worked in the NFL. And when it comes to fourth down decisions, this is a major place where the default fourth down decision is to send out the punt team or maybe the field goal team, but the default is not to go for it. So my contention is that the coaches, when they're making this decision, they're thinking, all right, check this box if we want to go for it. And usually they don't go for it. I would say if I were running a team and in charge, I would tell the coach, make your default that you are going to go for it. And you have to make a very active decision not to go for it. And I think that would really change the frequency at which people would go for fourth downs. And this is a picture that I took at Patriots Jaguars game a few years back. And you can see it's fourth down. You've got the punt team is already running on even before the coach made the decision. So the coach really has to make a very active decision to not go for it. Now, in baseball, we are certainly not immune to this. In baseball, the default pitch historically has always been the fastball. If you look, this is at Major League Baseball in 2019. We had almost 300,000 fastballs and far fewer breaking balls, which is curveballs and sliders, and far fewer changeups. Now, when you look, and there's a lot of numbers on here, I won't get into all of them, but a really important measure of outcomes in baseball is that second column or third column, WOBA. And that is a pretty good catch-all for how successful a plate appearance was. And you can see fastballs with a WOBA of 359 are much more successful for the batters than breaking balls or changeups. And so why do we keep throwing so many more fastballs? One of the excuses is, well, fastballs are actually easier to locate in the zone, and you're throwing fastballs in more advantageous situations for the pitcher. And that is totally true. And so we have systems, obviously, that we can control for that. So let's look at just full counts. These are every one of these pitches was thrown in the same count. So it was 3 and 2. So one more strike would lead to a strikeout. One more ball would lead to a walk. And we see that gap, that WOBA gap, does shrink significantly, but it still exists and it's still really significant. And when you think about how hard pitchers are working, coaches are working, people in the front office are working, this is a really huge gap still, even when you control for count. And so I would say that default of fastball that all of our pitchers and pitching coaches have grown up with is really causing people to make suboptimal decisions. Now, I just thought a cool look. This is a series of heat maps that we give to our pitchers and our coaches where we can show them where our pitch is successful. And just looking at this, you can see the more red it is, the worse it is. And other than throwing changeups and splitters, which you really don't want to throw high in the zone, the only other place where you really see a lot of red, significant amounts of red, is fastballs. And so fastballs and sinkers, which are both basically subsets of the same pitch. So you can see just visually, you don't have to look at the data kind of numerically. You can actually just see with a picture that, wow, why are we throwing these fastballs? If you throw a slider down the middle, people actually don't hit it that well. If you throw a fastball or a sinker down the middle, they tend to really dominate it. So what is happening with baseball decisions? People are basically checking the box and they are not throwing enough off speed. Now, the Twins as an organization, we know about this. And you can see I joined the team in 2017. And last year was a strange year. We didn't get to play a full season. But you can see that especially after 2018, we made a huge organizational commitment to throwing many more non-fastballs. And this number continues to go down. And at some point there may be a rebound and batters will be expecting it. And it's all a game of cat and mouse. But you can see we're making major changes. And the Twins, we throw among the fewest fastballs in the league. However, if I actually just looked at the data from 2021, league-wide, the average team is throwing about 50% fastballs this year. So the league has certainly shifted a whole lot. But these trends have been true for many years. And it's only relatively recently that teams are really taking advantage of this. So we've talked about a couple different things that get in the way of good process. We've talked about loss aversion. We've talked about defaults. I have one more thing that can get in the way of good process, and that's just that our memories sometimes stink. And so we're going to talk about colonoscopies, which I'm guessing we haven't discussed yet at this conference. But the colonoscopies, basically, if you haven't received a colonoscopy, you should maybe talk to your doctor about getting one. But the short version is that when you get a colonoscopy, a colonoscope goes inside your body, not through your mouth, and it tends to be somewhat painful. And these were people who got it without going under general anesthesia. So the colonoscope goes inside you, and it's moving around, and sometimes the pain is quite intense. And sometimes it's moderate, but it's never particularly pleasant. And so this study that happened in Canada, the control group received a regular colonoscopy, and the treatment group received a treatment that I think nobody here would willingly want to sign up for, and that is that the procedure was lengthened by 1 minute with the colonoscope staying inside the person's body, but stationary. And so this meant it was one of those moments of relatively lower pain, but again, still not particularly pleasant. And so if we graph this out, we can see the control group. This is kind of pain level through time. The control group, there's peaks and valleys. And then you can see they take the colonoscope out at 15 minutes, which is the time of relatively high pain. The treatment group has the exact same treatment, except they have this 1 extra minute that's relatively low pain. And so their peak pains were the same, but the end pain for the control group or for the treatment group was much lower. And what happened when they asked people, how did you perceive this experience? And when they actually looked to see which people were more likely to come back for colonoscopies in the future, which group was more likely to return, you would think the group that had less overall pain would want to come back more. But in fact, it was that treatment group that came back much more frequently. And this is what's known as the peak end effect. That people, when they perceive an experience, it's really hard to essentially take the integral of all that pain and remember what that was. It's much easier, much more convenient to remember that peak pain and the end pain when assessing an experience. And so in this case, the treatment group actually liked their experience much more. So that is clearly something that can get in the way. Now, I've talked about a lot of biases, a lot of things that can get in the way of good process. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can maybe fight some of those biases with data. And so this is one of my favorite examples. It's super simple. You don't have to understand advanced baseball statistics whatsoever. If you know batting average, you probably have that a batting average of 300 in your mind as a benchmark for somebody who's got a very high batting average. And in this example, and I actually messed it up, I recently changed it, that should be Josh Reddick. but we're looking at two different players, Jose Altuve and Josh Reddick. One batted 298 in the season, one batted 275. They both had just about the same number of at-bats, both had about 500 at-bats. So over the course of the season, there were only 11 hits that were different between the two. And that means over the course of a season, which is about 26 weeks, we're only talking about 0.4 hits per week. Now, at the end of the year, the person who bats 298 is much more valuable than the person who bats 275. But if you're just sitting there watching, if you're like that person, maybe getting the colonoscopy and you're just kind of trying to remember what happened, there is no chance that you are going to remember that that top batter, Jose Altuve, actually got on base significantly more. And so this is just an example. It's a super, super simple example of just write things down and actually tally them up. And it's amazing what a very, very, very large difference that can make. And if we look to the world of basketball, we see this is kind of the math of basketball and the idea of expected value from every shot. And this is based on the 2010-2011 season. So going back a few years, but you can see the field goal percentage on 2-point shots in 2010, 2011 was about 49%. They make 2 points for every time they're successful. And so that meant there was a little less than 1 point per shot on average, that expected points. On 3-pointers, they make them, players would make them much less frequently. However, they're worth 50% more. And when you do out the expected value, basically every shot was going to get you an extra, every 3-point shot in expectations was 0.1 more points. Now, a basketball game is usually going to have about 100 possessions. And so if you're turning your shots, it would be a little ridiculous to shoot all 3-pointers, but we're talking about what could add up to 10 points a game, which is a huge, huge difference. But this is an area that I would argue, whether it's, you could probably call it loss aversion. There's also maybe some default, because the default previously was to shoot a lot of 2s. Whatever you want to call it, people really were acting suboptimally and giving up a lot of points by not shooting nearly enough 3-pointers. And some of that was because it just feels bad to miss shots more frequently, even though the value of those shots that you make is so much higher. And so you can see this is a picture of the Memphis Grizzlies shot chart from 2010, 2011. I just grabbed a random team, and you can see the reds are misses, the greens are makes. You can see they're kind of just scattered all over. The only pattern, one small pattern you can discern, is that players were smart enough to know they shouldn't shoot a shot just inside the 3-point line, because if you shoot it just inside the 3-point line, it's basically just as hard as a 3-point shot, but it's only worth 2. And so you can see there are very few shots that people would shoot on the line there. But other than that, really, it's kind of scattered all over. And then you fast forward a handful of years, and this is just 6 years later. This is the Houston Rockets shot chart. You can see, number one, they're shooting a ton more 3-pointers. Number two, they shoot very few. This is the entire season. There are very, very few shots they're shooting in that mid-range, because those shots, statistically, they're still only worth 2 points, but they're much, much harder to make. And so you can see the game has really changed. And this is just another example. This is based on the 2016, 2017. I haven't updated the slide for a while, but you can see this is the number of 3-point attempts per game. And the teams in green are the 2016, 2017 teams. The teams in red are 2003 and 2004. So we're talking about a decent span, but it's pretty amazing how different the game is over the course of those 13 years. The team that had the second most attempts in 2004, so a team that was considered a really heavy 3-point shooting team, if you place them in the world of 2017, they are actually the least aggressive 3-point shooting team in all of basketball. So pretty amazing change in a relatively short period, largely because people just started doing the math and understood we should overcome these biases and it's okay to miss more. This is an example. This is a game, I guess the two different teams that have both been led by Daryl Morey, who's one of the real pioneers of data in the NBA. But this is an entire game from a few years ago between the Rockets and the Philadelphia 76ers. And you can see in the entire game, there were only a few shots really shot in that mid-range area. And not so coincidentally, if you look for the rocket side, the red dots, all of the mid-range shots, basically all the shots outside of the very close range that weren't three-pointers were made, and that's likely because they were wide open, where you would expect, obviously, a much higher percentage of those shots to be made than normal controlling for the distance. So basically, stats have wildly changed the NBA, and so this is, I just thought, a pretty cool visualization there. Now, before I end, I want to also leave and say I want to share a little story about having the right data, and also maybe just a story of humility. So this is a story of a concept called catcher framing, and basically what this is when the catcher receives the ball, the umpire then makes a decision whether it was a ball or a strike. And the umpire is a human and subject to all kinds of biases. And it turns out that for many years, scouts were saying this catcher is particularly good at this idea of framing. They catch the ball in a way that the umpires are much more likely to call it a strike. And that could be extremely valuable. And for years, the data people said, that sounds kind of like hooey. That's exactly kind of the old school. You're talking about heart and stuff that we don't really believe in. And it really was kind of tossed aside. Fast forward a few years to the point where we have very precise data on every pitch. And we now have models where we can say with a fair degree of precision, controlling for the umpire, controlling for all sorts of different factors, that there is a real effect of the way the catcher receives the ball. And so this is a heat map that shows where a catcher is basically creating more strikes compared to the average. And so you can see this is the heat map for one of our catchers, Mitch Garver. And you can see in that bottom left zone, that kind of outside pitch, he's very good, low and outside. He was very good at creating more strikes. And it turns out that that is extremely valuable. And that is something that basically analysts for years really did not fully appreciate until we had the right data. So the takeaway I have from this story is we need to remain humble. We're always going to be learning new things. And sometimes there are people who may not share our view of the world, but may have some really good ideas, and we shouldn't just throw them aside and say, well, that's old school and we don't want to hear it anymore. We need to keep checking, and as we get more data, a lot of the things we believe today will probably turn out to be false. And so here is a small video. It's probably not the most exciting video, but here's an example of our catcher, Mitch Garver, stealing a strike, a pitch that is outside the zone, that he turned into a strike by the way he received it. So you can see it was just outside, but really nicely kind of jerked it up into the zone, and the umpire was more or less fooled. So that is all I have today. But just to conclude, even in situations where we're relatively informed, these cognitive biases, loss aversion, peak end effect, defaults, they can impact our decision. And being aware of these biases can help you overcome them. And systematic analysis can reduce bias. And so if you enjoy this stuff, I know Fish is one of the real pioneers on an academic level on this stuff, training at UC Berkeley, but Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, somebody Fish was near at Berkeley for years, or Thinking in Bets. If you enjoy poker, I would highly recommend as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Dan, thank you so much. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news about anything that happened this afternoon, but I so appreciate you coming and joining us, and hope you make continued good decisions regardless of outcome. Thank you again to everyone for coming. I am so glad this came together. I'm so excited about our community. One of the things that I joke about is that Mozart Data just turned 1 year old, and 90% of businesses fail in their first year. So we're in the top 10% of businesses. But beyond that, we've been able to assemble a number of folks that obviously have a passion for using data, and we've got to hear from a variety of different players, from customers to our leadership, to our engineering team and prospects and investors as well. So I'm really glad that we brought all these folks together today, and hope you got something, whether that was something about data stacks, whether that was something about baseball, or whether that's something about the evolution of analysis. You can almost see it go from, my early stages where I was just kind of learning the difference between players to something that, Dan can present to this group. So I hope that everybody's enjoyed themselves. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to catch you again very soon. One quick plug. I'll be following up this talk with a Q&A session on Clubhouse. We call it the after party. So feel free to join us for the after party. The link will be in the chat, but right now I will also share my screen, which also has the link. So feel free to join us on Clubhouse. And thank you again, and hope you had a great time.